Paper 153, The Crisis at Capernaum. On Friday evening, the day of their arrival at Bethsaida, and on Sabbath morning, the apostles noticed that Jesus was seriously occupied with some momentous problem. They were cognizant that the Master was giving unusual thought to some important matter. He ate no breakfast, and but little at noontide. All of Sabbath morning and the evening before, the 12 and their associates were gathered together in small groups about the house, in the garden, and along the seashore. There was a tension of uncertainty and a suspense of apprehension resting upon all of them. Jesus had said little to them since they left Jerusalem. Not in months had they seen the Master so preoccupied and uncommunicative. Even Simon Peter was depressed, if not downcast. Andrew was at a loss to know what to do for his dejected associates. Nathanael said they were in the midst of the lull before the storm. Thomas expressed the opinion that something out of the ordinary is about to happen. Philip advised David Zebedee to forget about plans for feeding and lodging the multitude until we know what the Master is thinking about. Matthew was putting forth renewed efforts to replenish the treasury. James and John talked over the forthcoming sermon in the synagogue and speculated much as to its probable nature and scope. Simon Zelotes expressed the belief, in reality a hope that the Father in heaven may be about to intervene in some unexpected manner for the vindication and support of his Son, while Judas Iscariot dared to indulge the thought that possibly Jesus was oppressed with regrets that he did not have the courage and daring to permit the 5,000 to proclaim him King of the Jews. It was from among such a group of depressed and disconsolate followers that Jesus went forth on this beautiful Sabbath afternoon to preach his epoch-making sermon in the Capernaum synagogue. The only word of cheerful greeting or well-wishing from any of his immediate followers came from one of the unsuspecting Alphaeus twins, who, as Jesus left the house on his way to the synagogue, saluted him cheerily and said, "We pray the Father will help you, and that we may have bigger multitudes than ever." 1. The setting of the stage. A distinguished congregation greeted Jesus at 3 o'clock on this exquisite Sabbath afternoon in the New Capernaum synagogue. Jairus presided and handed Jesus the Scriptures to read. The day before, 53 Pharisees and Sadducees had arrived from Jerusalem. More than 30 of the leaders and rulers of the neighboring synagogues were also present. These Jewish religious leaders were acting directly under orders from the Sanhedrin at Jerusalem, and they constituted the Orthodox vanguard which had come to inaugurate open warfare on Jesus and his disciples. Sitting by the side of these Jewish leaders in the synagogue seats of honor were the official observers of Herod Antipas, who had been directed to ascertain the truth concerning the disturbing reports that an attempt had been made by the populace to proclaim Jesus the King of the Jews over in the domains of his brother Philip. Jesus comprehended that he faced the immediate declaration of avowed and open warfare by his increasing enemies, and he elected boldly to assume the offensive. At the feeding of the 5,000, he had challenged their ideas of the material Messiah. Now he chose again openly to attack their concept of the Jewish deliverer. This crisis, which began with the feeding of the 5,000, and which terminated with this Sabbath afternoon sermon, was the outward turning of the tide of popular fame and acclaim. Henceforth, the work of the kingdom was to be increasingly concerned with the more important task of winning lasting spiritual converts for the truly religious brotherhood of mankind. This sermon marks the crisis in the transition from the period of discussion, controversy, and decision to that of open warfare and final acceptance or final rejection. The Master well knew that many of his followers were slowly but surely preparing their minds finally to reject him. He likewise knew that many of his disciples were slowly but certainly passing through that training of mind and that discipline of soul which would enable them to triumph over doubt and courageously to assert their full-fledged faith in the gospel of the kingdom. Jesus fully understood how men prepare themselves for the decisions of a crisis and the performance of sudden deeds of courageous choosing by the slow process of the reiterated choosing between the recurring situations of good and evil. He subjected his chosen messengers to repeated rehearsals in disappointment and provided them with frequent and testing opportunities for choosing between the right and the wrong way of meeting spiritual trials. He knew he could depend on his followers, when they met the final test, to make their vital decisions in accordance with prior and habitual mental attitudes and spirit reactions. This crisis in Jesus' earth life began with the feeding of the 5,000 and ended with this sermon in the synagogue. The crisis in the lives of the apostles began with this sermon in the synagogue and continued for a whole year, ending only with the Master's trial and crucifixion. As they sat there in the synagogue that afternoon before Jesus began to speak, there was just one great mystery, just one supreme question in the minds of all. Both his friends and his foes pondered just one thought, and that was, why did he himself so deliberately and effectively turn back the tide of popular enthusiasm? And it was immediately before and immediately after this sermon that the doubts and disappointments of his disgruntled adherents grew into unconscious opposition and eventually turned into actual hatred. It was after this sermon in the synagogue that Judas Iscariot entertained his first conscious thought of deserting, but he did, for the time being, effectively master all such inclinations. Everyone was in a state of perplexity. Jesus had left them dumbfounded and confounded. He had recently engaged in the greatest demonstration of supernatural power to characterize his whole career. The feeding of the 5,000 was the one event of his earth life which made the greatest appeal to the Jewish concept of the expected Messiah. But this extraordinary advantage was immediately and unexplainedly offset by his prompt and unequivocal refusal to be made king. On Friday evening, and again on Sabbath morning, the Jerusalem leaders had labored long and earnestly with Jairus to prevent Jesus' speaking in the synagogue, but it was of no avail. Jairus' only reply to all this pleading was, "I have granted this request, and I will not violate my word." 2. The Epical Sermon. Jesus introduced this sermon by reading from the law as found in Deuteronomy. "But it shall come to pass, if this people will not hearken to the voice of God, that the curses of transgression shall surely overtake them. The Lord shall cause you to be smitten by your enemies, you shall be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. And the Lord shall bring you and the king you have set up over you into the hands of a strange nation. You shall become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations. Your sons and your daughters shall go into captivity. The strangers among you shall rise high in authority, while you are brought very low. And these things shall be upon you and your seed forever, because you would not hearken to the word of the Lord. Therefore shall you serve your enemies who shall come against you. You shall endure hunger and thirst, and wear this alien yoke of iron. The Lord shall bring against you a nation from afar, from the end of the earth, a nation whose tongue you shall not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, a nation which will have little regard for you. And they shall besiege you in all your towns until the high fortified walls wherein you have trusted come down, and all the land shall fall into their hands. And it shall come to pass that you will be driven to eat the fruit of your own bodies, the flesh of your sons and daughters, during this time of siege, because of the straitness wherewith your enemies shall press you." And when Jesus had finished this reading, he turned to the prophets and read from Jeremiah. "If you will not hearken to the words of my servants, the prophets whom I have sent you, then will I make this house like Shiloh, and I will make this city a curse to all the nations of the earth." And the priests and the teachers heard Jeremiah speak these words in the house of the Lord. And it came to pass that, when Jeremiah had made an end of speaking all that the Lord had commanded him to speak to all the peoples, the priests and teachers laid hold of him, saying, "You shall surely die." And all the people crowded around Jeremiah in the house of the Lord. And when the princes of Judah heard these things, they sat in judgment on Jeremiah. Then spoke the priests and the teachers to the princes and to all the people, saying, "This man is worthy to die, for he has prophesied against our city, and you have heard him with your own ears." Then spoke Jeremiah to all the princes and to all the people. "The Lord sent me to prophesy against this house and against this city all the words which you have heard. Now therefore amend your ways and reform your doings, and obey the voice of the Lord your God, that you may escape the evil which has been pronounced against you. As for me, behold, I am in your hands. Do with me as seems good and right in your eyes. But know you for certain that, if you put me to death, you shall bring innocent blood upon yourselves and upon this people, for of a truth the Lord has sent me to speak all these words in your ears." The priests and teachers of that day sought to kill Jeremiah, but the judges would not consent, albeit for his words of warning they did let him down by cords in a filthy